Cool. What's that?
I think that was
Oh,
Blue Jeans saying the recording started.
oh, fantastic. All right. My name is Perry Cronin Cole. I'm a design engineer at Ameriprise Financial, and I'm going to be presenting tonight on creating an AMI with Ansible. So to start by going over what the presentation will cover. First, I'm going to talk about why you might actually want to create your own AMI with Ansible. Some things that you're probably going to need in order to actually start creating a playbook for this, a few helpful resources, and then I'm just going to dive right in and tell you a skeleton process for how you can actually create a playbook for creating your own AMI through AWS with Ansible. So right from the top, I'm going to use a lot of AWS jargon. This is very AWS specific, but looking through the module index on the Ansible documentation online, there are a lot of other modules for other cloud services like Azure, Google, etc. So if your needs differ from mine, if you're using a different platform, I would review the module index on Ansible and look for details on that, because I'm sure that a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be covering tonight for AWS could also be done in other cloud services. So from the top, you might be asking yourselves why you want to make your own AMI rather than just using a publicly available AMI. There are a bunch of different reasons why you might want to do it. Obviously, if you're working at an organization where security is a concern, you might want to create your own AMI because you can go through the CIS hardening standards for an AMI on your own, make your own determination about how you want to configure your system to meet those standards. And you can bake those standards into an AMI, in addition to any other security and monitoring tools that you want to install. Those can be done at the AMI level, so any EC2 instances that you create through AWS in the future from that AMI will have that configuration baked into it. This leads me to the second point, why you might want to create your own AMI: consistency. If you have your own AMI and you use that as the basis for all EC2 instances on a particular operating system, that gives you a remarkable level of consistency in the instances that you create for your organization. And if you're going to be creating a lot of instances and be doing it fairly regularly, this brings up a third point why you might want to have your own AMI, which is efficiency. Creating the configuration for an EC2 instance, if you just do it manually, can take hours. If you have to do this every time you create an EC2 instance in AWS, that's going to be very, very time consuming. Baking everything in at the AMI level will save you dozens of hours, at least, over the long haul. Okay. So, before we dive in and start talking about how you might craft a playbook for creating an AMI through AWS with Ansible, there are a couple of things that you're going to need. Just in AWS in general, if you're going to be creating an EC2 instance, you need to have a role or a user with permissions for the EC2 service. And if you're going to be using a credential through an Ansible playbook, you're going to have an IAM user. So the IAM user that you actually use for a credential, when you pass that into your playbook, whether you're doing this from the command line or whether you're doing this through Ansible Tower, the IAM user that you use here is going to have the STS assume role permission for an IAM role that actually has those EC2 permissions for describing EC2 instances, creating an EC2 instance, creating AMIs, if you need to do any cleanup later, deleting old instances and AMIs, etc. So that's what you need from strictly an IAM perspective, and that credential will have to be passed to your playbook somehow. In addition, when you create an EC2 instance with the playbook that I'm going to be describing, you're going to have a way of connecting to that instance so that your playbook can actually configure an instance before you create an AMI from it. And for that, you're going to need a machine credential with the private key for whatever key pair you actually use when you create your instance. Now, if some of this doesn't make sense at this point, hopefully it'll make more sense when I actually go through the playbook, and you'll understand why you need both of these credentials in place. So a little bit more information about the IAM role that's actually going to be doing the provisioning here through the AWS credential. You're going to need pretty broad EC2 permissions for describing and listing EC2 resources. And throughout the process, as I'm going to be explaining, you're going to be creating and terminating both EC2 instances as well as machine images or AMIs. So at a high level, this is what your IAM role is going to have permission to do. A few helpful resources in here. Josh mentioned that we should make this PowerPoint available. I can add hyperlinks in here for the actual links for this, but the Ansible user guide is a good general reference, and I'm going to be referencing a lot of the AWS modules that are made available through Ansible. So the module index in general is very, very helpful. And I'm going to be talking mostly about the AWS modules, but especially when it comes time for configuring your instance, you're going to want to use a lot of the more general modules, which also makes the module index a very useful resource. Okay, so now onto the main event. Let's say you're at this point where you have your IAM user and role, you have it up in AWS, you've created all of the credentials that you're going to be using, passing it to your playbook through the command line or through Ansible Tower. Now you actually want to create a playbook for creating your own AMI. You can do this in basically 3 plays, which boils down to 3 different kinds of buckets. You're going to create a temporary EC2 instance. That is going to be the basis for your configuration. Once you have an EC2 instance, you're going to be able to configure that instance, which will be the content of the second play in your playbook. Once you've completed all of that configuration at the EC2 instance level, you can move on to the third play, which will be creating an AMI from that temporary instance, and then cleaning up any resources in AWS that you don't need after that, like your temporary instance, or any old AMIs for that matter. All right. So going into this in a little bit more detail, the first thing you're going to do in your playbook is you've passed your IAM user credential to your playbook when you've created this job. The IAM user has the ability to assume the role for the IAM role that's actually going to be doing this provisioning. So when you've assumed that role, this first play, creating a temporary instance, is done on your local host. And the majority of this play is just creating the EC2 instance. And for this, the EC2 module is what you're going to be using. Now, if you look through the module index, you'll see there are a lot of different parameters that can be passed to a task that's using this module. So you're going to need to know certain things in order to actually create this instance. A key pair, for example, is obviously very, very important because that's going to be the basis for your machine credential and how you're actually going to be able to connect to this instance going forward. But you'll also need to know information like a VPC subnet, a security group that you want to identify with it. This is also where you can add tags to your EC2 instance in case you're tracking that at an organization level. So in general, and this applies to just about everything I'm going to be talking about here, review the module index for the modules that I'm talking about here, and it'll give you a good idea of what you actually need to pass to these tasks that you create in order to create these resources. So you have a task in this first play for creating an EC2 instance. And if you register the output of that task, you can use the content of that registered variable to pull the IP address for the instance that you just created. This will be important because you're actually going to need to run the second play on the instance that you just created. So you're going to have to add this to a temporary inventory. And that's where the add host module can come in handy. So I like to include a pause for the instance to become available. There are a couple of different modules you can use depending on whether you're provisioning a Linux or a Windows instance that might be a little bit more less hacky than just using a pause. But if you just need to wait for an instance to become available, you can add a pause for a couple of minutes in there. And like I said, the add host module can be used to add the IP address for your new instance to a temporary inventory. This basically, at a high level, is what the first play is all about, creating a temporary instance that's going to be the basis for the configuration for your AMI. Once you have this in place, you can move to the second play of your playbook. And the reason why we chunked it out this way is the first play was run against the local host because everything that you were doing was just establishing a connection to AWS so you can use the AWS Ansible modules to create an instance. This second play is going to be run on the group that's specified in that inventory. So when you ran that add host task, adding the IP address for your temporary instance to the inventory, you're adding it to an inventory group. And the second play can be run against that group in order to do this configuration. Now, I don't have a lot of information on how to actually configure the temporary instance and what you're actually going to need to do here, because obviously your needs are probably going to vary from my needs. So this is where you will want to look through the standards for your own company or through the CIS hardening standards, look at the tools that you actually want to install on all of the instances that your organization puts out there. Once you have a list of all those things that need to be baked into an AMI, this play is where you can bake those tools and configurations into your temporary EC2 instance. One thing that I like to note here is that if you're distinguishing between Linux and Windows operating systems, a lot of the Ansible modules run just fine on Linux, but there are very Windows-specific modules that you'll probably have to use if you're running this against a Windows host, and they're usually prefixed with Windows _. If you look at the module index, if you look at how they're grouped, there's a specific grouping just for Windows modules, so that can be a helpful resource if you're trying to create a configuration for Windows hosts. So this is probably going to be the majority of your actual playbook, is this play that does the configuration. Now, once you've finished that play, you're going to run a third play, and this will come back and be run on the local host. So you have an EC2 instance. You've registered the results of that first EC2 module task that you ran. And so you have the ID, the instance ID, for that EC2 instance. You can now use the EC2 AMI module to create an AMI from that instance. And this is also helpful because if you have old AMIs that you want to clean up, the state parameter in the EC2 AMI module will allow you to deregister any old AMIs too. So that can be a separate task in this play as well. This is helpful if, for example, you are trying to maintain patches and you only have one AMI per month or per 90 days that is up to date with the latest patches. You probably don't want anybody to use the old AMIs, so you probably want to deregister all those old AMIs. That can be done in a play like this as well. But note too that the EC2 AMI module does not give you an opportunity to encrypt the AMI that you create from it. And that's because initially creating an AMI does not give you that option. The AMIs are unencrypted by default. So if that is a concern and you need to encrypt your AMI, you're going to have to copy the unencrypted AMI that the EC2 AMI module makes. The EC2 AMI copy module. The EC2 AMI copy module contains parameters for encrypted and the KMS key ID, which you can use if you do need to encrypt your AMI. Additionally, like the EC2 module, the EC2 AMI and EC2 AMI copy modules contain a parameter for adding tags. So again, if you're keeping track of these resources at an organizational level and you have standard tags that you need to apply, you can do that here. And a final task that I like to include because you don't want all these temporary EC2 instances hanging out there. One final task, again invoking the EC2 module, call it against the instance ID for the temporary EC2 instance that you just created, setting the state parameter to absent. That will terminate the old EC2 instance. At a high level, that is what you need to do to create an AMI. Now, if you or your organization, if you maintain a division of environments for development, non-production, production, you might want to create an AMI at something like a development level, and perhaps you want to share that AMI to your non-production and production AWS accounts. So if you're actually trying to share an AMI across accounts, Ansible can also be used to do this automatically. There is a launch permissions parameter on the EC2 AMI module where you can specify the AWS accounts where this AMI should be shared. And any account that's used here, that's listed in the launch permissions parameter of that EC2 AMI module will be allowed to use that AMI. One caveat that I'll add here is that if you create an AMI and you use the launch permissions to share it to multiple accounts, any tags that you add in that same EC2 AMI or EC2 AMI copy module, any tags that you add there will not follow to the AMI as seen in those other accounts. You'll have to do a separate play or a separate playbook where you connect to each of those other accounts and you run the EC2 AMI module to add those tags in there. So that covers, again, at a high level, how you would actually go about creating a playbook for creating an AMI and how you would share it and add encryption if you needed to do it. The last slide here is just for any questions that are out there. I don't have a demo to go along with it, but that gives you a nutshell version of how you'd create a playbook like this.
Awesome. Anybody have any questions before I cut the recording off?
Yes, a question. Like I was requesting if it's possible for me to have the copy of these slides.
Yeah, that's a good question. Joshua and I were talking about this just before the call. I'm going to send him the link to this presentation, and I believe he's going to make it available afterwards.
Yes, they will be posted somewhere to be determined. Any other questions?
Yeah, another question, like, okay, can we use the same method to delete them?
Yes. Are you talking about EC2 instances or AMIs?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And in fact, if this is going to be part of like a scheduled maintenance, you might even want to include that in your playbook as just another task in the play that creates the AMI, that third play of your playbook. If you're going to be creating a new AMI that's going to be the basis for all of your EC2 instances going forward, you might want to deregister the old AMI, and that can be done by invoking the EC2 AMI module for the AMI ID that you want to deregister. So there should be a parameter, I think it's called image ID, or maybe just image, for the AMI ID, and the state parameter can just be set to absent for any AMI that you want to terminate.
Hey, this is John. Can you kind of go over, I mean, thank you for, showing us the way you went about doing it. Tell us about the learning process. What did you have to go through to learn when you were picking out the different things in the AMI module that, okay, this is a potential gotcha for somebody who's doing this for the first time? I'm looking more about the process to craft the playbook versus creating an AMI.
Yeah, that's a very good question because, I mean, when I say that you can create an AMI in 3 plays and, I fit everything on like 3 PowerPoint slides, it makes it look really easy and it's not.
Right.
There's definitely a learning curve that's associated with it. In my own experience, I've had the benefit of working with a team that was already creating these AMIs before I joined, so I got to benefit from their experience a little bit. But I would say that if you're curious about any aspect of this process, like let's just say, as a first step, you want to create an AMI, so you wonder how am I going to create an AMI? The first thing that I would do is look at the module index for the EC2 AMI module and just see what needs to go in there. And I would ask myself, what parameters need to be passed to any task invoking this module? And how am I going to determine the values that I'm going to put in this task? And from that, I would use that as a jumping off point for what else do I need to know, right? Because if I'm going to be creating an AMI from an EC2 instance, I'm going to have to know that ID in order to pass it into the EC2 AMI task that I'm going to be creating. And that goes for a couple of the other things that are going to have to be passed in there as well. So I would start by kind of working backwards, finding out what you need to do to create an AMI, and then finding everything else that goes on top of that.
So is that kind of like create the first one manually, then, backport, so to speak, into automation?
Yeah, that can also be helpful too. I mean, especially if you're going through your own organization's security standards and you're trying to figure out what configuration needs to be part of any AMI that you create, you'll probably want to go through it manually to figure out how exactly the configuration needs to be done. And then ask yourself, for every step that you did in that manual configuration, how am I going to automate this with a task in Ansible? Something that you might also want to consider that, again, is kind of waved over because I didn't really include a lot of information for configuring that temporary instance. Because, again, this is really going to comprise the bulk of your playbook, especially if you're adding a lot of different configuration in here. I would chunk this out into roles as much as possible. So, for example, if you have configuration that you're doing on the instance, I might separate that from, for example, installing a particular tool, because installing a tool will probably come with its own set of tasks. So however you can chunk that out so that it's really clear what goes into it. Hopefully that made sense. Any other questions?
All right, last call. Any questions?